Hey guys, tonight we're pulling back the curtains on the strange, tender, slightly ridiculous hobbies of the First World War trenches. Not the nostalgic poppy on a lapel version, the real one, where a young man in knee-deep Flanders mud is carefully carving a tiny rose into a brass shell casing while the sky whistles overhead. Before you get comfortable, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this. It's a small, quiet gesture, the kind of thing that helps a little channel like this one keep telling long, slow stories into the dark. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. I genuinely love reading them in the morning. And now, the ritual. Dim those lights, switch on a fan, pull your blanket up, get comfortable. Let your phone rest face down on the nightstand. Because tonight, unlike the poor Tommy in his dugout, you are allowed to forget the outside world entirely. You do not have to stay awake for all of this. Drifting off is the point. The narration will grow softer and slower as the hours pass. And if you wake tomorrow halfway through a sentence about a man and his pet rat, you can simply come back the next night and find your place. Try a slow breath in for 3 and out for 4. No jump scares, no sudden noises. Just the gentle murmur of history, like someone reading from an old leather-bound book across a low fire. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what a soldier actually did with his day? Because the truth is, a man in the trenches spent maybe 4 or 5 hours fighting at the very most, and something like 19 hours just waiting. 19 hours a day. Every day. For years. So what did a young Tommy from Manchester, standing in 6 inches of cold water, actually do with those 19 hours? What did it feel like to sit in a candlelit dugout the size of a garden shed, shoulder to shoulder with 4 other men, and slowly, carefully tap floral patterns into the brass of a shell casing with a nail and a hammer? Why did French poilus become quietly obsessed with breeding pet mice in biscuit tins? And why did a German infantryman, somewhere in the Argonne forest, spend 3 months carving an entire chess set from the bones of his beef ration? What exactly was louse-racing? And why did British officers bet an entire week's pay on which tiny white parasite would be the first to cross an upturned dinner plate? Why did the British Army, the actual, official British Army, sanction drag pantomimes behind the lines, complete with silk dresses stitched from parachutes and wigs made from a Parisian widow's donated hair? How did Ouija boards and seances sweep from the Somme to Gallipoli like a quiet fever? And why, genuinely, did men who were knee-deep in corpses suddenly become passionate gardeners, planting radishes and marigolds along the tops of their sandbags? And the question underneath all the others, the one I keep coming back to in the dark. What does it say about us, about human beings, that when you give us unlimited horror and unlimited boredom in the same small muddy space, we stubbornly, almost helplessly, choose to make tiny, beautiful, ridiculous things? Congratulations. You've just woken up in the evening of November 4th, 1915, on the British-held sector near Plugsteert Wood. The men here call it Plug Street, because Flemish is hard and homesickness is easy. The rain has just stopped. A thin, ghost-white mist is rising off the duckboards. You are in a candlelit dugout roughly the size of a pantry, sitting on an ammunition crate with 3 other men. One is knitting a sock from unraveled sandbag twine. One is teaching a tame rat named Winston to stand on his hind legs for a crumb of bully beef. One is writing a limerick, and one is carefully carving the initials of a girl in Derbyshire into the aluminum nose cone of a dud German shell. A gramophone hisses out a scratched waltz. Good luck. Let's start with the man carving those initials, because he is the beginning of one of the strangest, most beautiful folk art movements of the 20th century. A movement almost nobody taught, nobody organized, and nobody particularly approved of. Trench art. The phrase sounds grand and gallery-ready now, like something you'd see behind glass with a little typed placard. But at the time, in the mud of 1915, it had no name at all. It was just what men did when their hands had nothing else to do and their minds had too much. It was a reflex, a compulsion, the kind of quiet, stubborn activity a person reaches for when the world has become unbearable and their fingers somehow still remember how to make things, to understand why it happened on such an astonishing scale. You have to understand the sheer industrial volume of metal that the First World War spat across the surface of Europe. Over the course of the war, the combatant nations fired somewhere in the region of 1.5 billion artillery shells. Take a moment and let that number sit there. 1.5 billion. Every single one of those shells left behind a brass casing, a copper driving band, a steel nose cap, a fuse, a fragment. The front, by 1916, was not just a landscape of craters and corpses and barbed wire. It was also, quietly, the largest open-air scrap metal yard in human history. And soldiers, being soldiers, began to pick things up. At first, it was probably accidental. A man bends down to tie a bootlace, sees a gleaming brass fragment in the mud, pockets it because brass is pretty, and he is bored. Back in the dugout, he turns it over in his hands. He taps it with the flat of his knife. It rings softly. He thinks, I could do something with this. Multiply that small private thought by 10 million men across 4 years, and you get trench art. Broadly, the craft settled into 3 great categories, and once you know them, you start seeing them in every antique shop in Britain, France, and Belgium, always tucked on the bottom shelf at suspiciously low prices because the dealer doesn't quite know what they are. The first and most famous category was the engraved shell casing, usually an 18-pounder or a 75mm French, hammered, tapped and etched into a vase. Put flowers in it, stand it on the mantelpiece, and you have a souvenir of the war to end all wars that also holds a nice bunch of daffodils. The second was the letter opener, almost always made from the copper driving band of a shell, that little ring of soft copper that grips the rifling as the shell leaves the gun. Flatten it, hammer it out, file a point, wrap the handle with wire, and there is your letter opener. The third was the matchbox cover, beaten from the tin lids of bully beef cans or ration tins, embossed with the regimental crest, a sweetheart's initials, or, very often, a tiny, wobbly Union Jack. Those were the big 3. But the craft spread in 100 smaller directions. Cigarette cases, picture frames, inkwells, napkin rings, crucifixes, miniature tanks, aluminum rings from melted-down Zeppelin fragments, candlesticks from stacked fuse caps, whole model aircraft made from rifle cartridges, and once, famously, a working clockwork model of a Somme windmill built entirely from bully beef tin, driven by a watch spring. The techniques, given the conditions, were genuinely remarkable. The most common was a method called repoussé, which sounds fancy, and technically is, but in the hands of a bored private, was nothing more than holding a nail against the inside of a brass cylinder and tapping the head of the nail with a hammer until a raised pattern appeared on the outside. Men learned to do this by candlelight, steadying the casing between their knees, and over the course of many evenings, they would raise whole wreaths of roses, thistles, shamrocks, and maple leaves onto the curved brass. A single decent vase might take 40 or 50 hours of tapping, which, when you have 19 empty hours a day, is less a hardship than a mercy. Acid etching was another favourite. The acid, being a resourceful army's resourceful acid, came directly from battery fluid drained out of signalling equipment. You coated your brass in wax, scratched your design through the wax with a pin, painted the exposed brass with the battery acid, and waited. What you got, if you were patient and didn't spill the acid onto your trousers, which several men did and regretted, was a permanent silvery dark design bitten straight into the metal. And then there was inlay, the real craft, the stuff that still makes museum curators breathe in sharply when they pick it up. Soldiers would drill a pattern into a soft aluminum fuse cap and tap in tiny pieces of copper cut from bullet jackets, producing two-tone works of astonishing delicacy. A regimental badge in copper set into an aluminum ring, finished with a polished edge, made in a hole in the ground, by candlelight, by a man who, before August 1914, had probably been a shop clerk. Some of these men have names. Private Harry Stinton of the West Yorkshire Regiment made an engraved 18-pounder vase that now sits quietly in a drawer in the Imperial War Museum in London, its brass tarnished to a soft gold, its raised flowers still standing up proud after more than 100 years. He was not a professional artist. He was a young man with a nail and some time. On the French side, a poilu named Léon Trémoulet, a Parisian jeweller before the war, produced hundreds, possibly thousands, of rings from downed Zeppelin aluminum, selling them for a few sous each to soldiers and civilians alike. Some of those rings are still worn today, passed down through families. The great-granddaughter of a Verdun veteran wearing on her finger a piece of German airship that was shot out of the sky in 1916. The most widely decorated object of the entire war was not, in fact, a shell. It was a small brass tin, about the size of a cigarette case, given to every British soldier and sailor serving overseas at Christmas 1914. It was called the Princess Mary Gift Box, funded by a public appeal organised by the 17-year-old Princess Mary herself. Inside, a pipe, tobacco, a Christmas card, a little pencil. The tin was nice. The contents got smoked within the week. But the tin was brass, it was smooth, and it was the exact right size to sit on a man's knee in a dugout and be etched. Men engraved their regimental crests on them, their sweethearts' names, battle dates, tiny maps of where they had been. By 1916, a decorated Princess Mary tin was almost a rite of passage. You can find them today by the thousand, each one a small pocket-sized autobiography of a man who mostly never made it home. All this making, of course, created a market, because soldiers, then as now, loved a bargain and loved a gift they could post to their mother. Trench art was traded in the estaminets, the little Belgian and French cafes, just behind the lines where off-duty men drank thin beer and ate overcooked eggs, for tobacco, for wine, for a few francs, for a favour. Rear echelon soldiers and passing officers would buy pieces made by men closer to the front. Civilians, especially in Poperinghe and Amiens, began to collect them. A whole small economy sprouted up in the shadow of the war, running on brass scrap and boredom. And here is where it gets darker. And funnier, in the way trench humour was always darker and funnier than anything civilian life could produce. Because the men making this art had a certain sense of humour about what they were working with. There is a cigarette lighter in a private collection in Belgium, lovingly made, highly polished, beautifully engraved, that was fashioned from a German bullet that had been dug out of the inside of the maker's comrade's helmet. The comrade survived. The bullet got a second life as a lighter. Whether that's ghoulish or tender or both depends on how long you've been awake and how much you've read about the war that evening. There is a matchbox cover made from a shell fragment that had killed a regimental horse. A letter opener filed from a piece of shrapnel that had missed its maker's head by an inch. A ring carved from the aluminum of a downed Fokker, worn, in the photograph that survives, by a grinning young RFC mechanic who has not yet realized he will be dead in a month. Trench art was never sentimental about its own materials. The war provided the brass, the men provided the hands. Nobody had the energy for squeamishness. Now, all of this might sound like a hobby that belonged strictly to the front line, but there is another, quieter half of the story, and it begins in the hospitals. By 1915, the British and French medical services had a problem. They had tens of thousands of convalescing soldiers, men with shattered legs, gas-burned lungs, shell shock, missing hands, and nothing for these men to do while they healed. Left alone on their wards, they brooded. They drank when they could get it. They stared at the ceilings. Morale collapsed. Recovery slowed. And so, almost by accident, the nurses and the orderlies began handing out brass. Give a man a hammer, a nail, and an empty shell casing, they discovered, and something curious happened. His hands stopped shaking quite so badly. His jaw unclenched. He concentrated on the tap, tap, tap of the metal, and for the first hour in a week, he was not thinking about what he had seen. The workshops that grew up in casualty clearing stations across France and Belgium are, in a very real sense, the origin of what we now call occupational therapy. Art therapy, in its modern clinical form, was born not in a genteel drawing room, but in a field hospital outside Etaples. The first patient, a 19-year-old private from Leeds, who had forgotten how to speak and had to be reintroduced to the world through a piece of brass and a nail. Belgian refugee craftsmen, forced out of their home villages and washed up in towns like Poperinge, lent a hand. Many of them had been professional metalworkers before the invasion of 1914. Now, with nothing left to lose and all day to teach, they sat down beside British and Canadian soldiers and showed them how to hold the hammer properly, how to anneal brass so it wouldn't crack, how to raise a pattern without tearing the metal. The distinctive style known today as the Ypres vase, graceful, fluted with bands of stylized flowers, came directly out of these workshops. You can tell an Ypres vase from across a room. It has the particular melancholy elegance of a craft taught by refugees to wounded strangers in a town that was, itself, being slowly ground into rubble. Behind the barbed wire of the prisoner of war camps, the same impulse took entirely different forms. French prisoners in German camps became famous for intricate wood and straw marquetry, delicate boxes and picture frames inlaid with tiny coloured straws in geometric patterns produced in the thousands. German prisoners held in British camps, meanwhile, specialised in bone. Bone ships, bone windmills, bone models of Rhineland castles, carved with extraordinary patience from the beef and mutton bones saved from mess rations. The museums of northern France are full of these today, silent little galleries of homesickness rendered in animal skeleton. Back in the trench dugout, though, the art was always more intimate, more rough, more personal. Picture the scene inside one of those dugouts again, the one from November 4th with your 4 companions and the hissing gramophone. The dominant sound in the small candlelit room is not, actually, the distant grumble of the guns. It is the chink, chink, chink of a nail being tapped slowly into brass. The smell is candle smoke and pipe tobacco and rifle oil, and the warm metallic tang of a shell casing that has been heating in a man's hand for an hour. The brass gets pleasantly warm as you work it, warmer than you'd expect. A small private fire. And while you work, you are thinking, whether you notice it or not, about the girl in Derbyshire, about your mother's garden, about the last meal you ate in a proper kitchen, about the shape of a rose petal, because you have to think about the shape of a rose petal very clearly indeed if you want to tap one into curved brass with any accuracy. That, right there, is what trench art was for. Not decoration, not profit, not even really making. It was a way of keeping the war at arm's length for 20 or 30 or 40 quiet minutes by focusing your entire mind on something very small, very beautiful, and very much not shaped like a bullet. Today, the world's museums hold tens of thousands of these objects. The Imperial War Museum, the In Flanders Fields Museum in Ypres, the Historial de la Grande Guerre in Péronne, the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. Walk through any of them, and you will find somewhere in a quiet corner a case full of brass vases and copper letter openers and little matchbox covers, each one tapped out by a man who was not supposed to have any time for beauty. And the strange, quiet miracle of it is that he made time anyway. Which raises, of course, the question of what else he did with those 19 hours. Because as much as a man can carve and tap and engrave, there is only so much brass in the world. And the trenches were full of other, stranger, furrier companions. Because if you had spent any real time in a front-line trench in 1915 or 1916, you would quickly have noticed that you were, in fact, never alone. Not for a moment. You might not have another human being within arm's reach, but you had company. Lots of it. Some of it had 4 legs. Some of it had 6. Some of it had wings. And some of it, to your horror, had fur and a tail and teeth, and was currently eyeing up your ration of bully beef with genuinely alarming interest. The trenches of the First World War were, among many other things, one of the strangest accidental zoos in human history. Almost every frontline unit on every side of the war eventually adopted at least one animal, and usually several. Dogs wandered in from abandoned French villages and simply never left. Cats took up residence in dugouts and became regimental celebrities. Canaries were carted up to the front in tiny wooden cages. Magpies were tamed, foxes were fed. At one point, a Canadian veterinary officer named Lieutenant Harry Colborne bought a live black bear cub from a hunter on a railway platform in White River, Ontario, in August 1914, named her Winnie after his hometown of Winnipeg, and brought her with him all the way to the army camp at Salisbury Plain, before, sensibly, donating her to London Zoo for the duration of the war. A little boy named Christopher Robin Milne used to come and visit her there. His father took notes. You know how this story ends. That's the thing about the menagerie of the Western Front. It is absolutely saturated with famous names you didn't know were famous. Take Sergeant Stubby, a stocky little Staffordshire Terrier mix of unknown origin who wandered onto the training field of the 102nd Infantry at Yale in 1917 and was promptly smuggled to France in the greatcoat of a Private J. Robert Conroy. Stubby was not just a mascot. Stubby was, genuinely, a war dog. He could smell mustard gas before human sentries could, and would bark and nip at sleeping men to wake them. He could distinguish the German-speaking voice of a spy from the American voices of his unit, and on one occasion is said to have pinned an infiltrator by the trouser seat until human soldiers arrived. He was wounded, gassed, decorated, promoted to sergeant, genuinely promoted on paper, and came home a national celebrity who met 3 sitting American presidents. When he died in 1926, his body was preserved, and he currently stands stuffed and dignified in the Smithsonian. You can go and say hello to him. 10 out of 10 recommend. Then there was Sergeant Bill, the goat of the 5th Canadian Battalion, who reportedly headbutted 3 of his comrades into a shell hole, probably saving their lives, just before the shell in question arrived. Togo the cat lived for 3 years in a French artillery battery and allegedly slept through every barrage. An entire generation of British coal miners turned soldiers knew exactly what to do with canaries at the front because they'd been doing it underground their whole working lives. Bring the bird, watch the bird. If the bird stops singing, you have approximately 40 seconds to make better life choices. But the animals that really colonized the trench soldier's imagination, the ones that became hobbies in their own right, were the unwelcome ones, the ones you weren't supposed to like, the ones that were, technically, the enemy, chief among them, the rat. Now, the wild rats of the Western Front were, let us be honest, awful. Reports from every army describe them as the size of small cats, bold as brass, unafraid of humans, and, crucially, extremely well fed. The reason they were well fed is a detail we won't linger on, except to say that the earth of Flanders in 1916 contained a great deal of protein that was not being claimed by anyone else. Rats ran over sleeping men's faces. Rats chewed through packs. Rats nibbled on unconscious wounded. Captain Sidney Rogerson of the West Yorkshires wrote of waking up to find one sitting on his chest, looking at him thoughtfully, as though considering whether he was worth starting on yet. So, naturally, what did the men do? They tamed them. This is one of the strangest pieces of trench psychology, and the more you sit with it, the more beautiful it becomes. Across the British, French, German and Australian lines, soldiers captured young rats, caged them in old biscuit tins punched with ventilation holes, fed them crumbs of hardtack and scraps of bully beef, and kept them as pets. They named them. And what did they name them? They named them after their enemies. There are letters home describing pet rats called Kitchener, Fritz, the Kaiser, Tirpitz, and, on at least one recorded occasion, a particularly fat rat named Sir Douglas Haig. One Highland sergeant is said to have owned a small grey specimen he referred to, with deep affection, as Asquith. Because, he explained, the creature did nothing very much but was somehow impossible to get rid of. French poilus went a step further with their mice. Biscuit tin mouse breeding became a genuine small fashion among the French line regiments of 1916 and 1917. Men bred white mice with brown mice, trained them to sit up for crumbs, and traded them between units. An entire small civilization of pet rodents existed along the chemin des dames, raised by men who, 6 hours earlier, had been trying to kill other men, and who, in 6 hours' time, would be trying to kill other men again. In between, they were delicately tweezing a sunflower seed into the paws of a mouse named Philippe. What do you do with that as a fact? You sit with it. And you realize quietly what the hobby was actually for. These men had taken the creature that most terrified them, the thing that crawled on their faces in the dark, and they had made it small, and named it, and fed it, and taught it tricks. They had turned horror into a pet. Psychologists today would call this reframing or exposure, or the symbolic domestication of trauma. The men at the time would have called it Winston and offered him a crumb of biscuit and laughed when he stood up on his back legs. Which brings us, with a certain inevitability, to the louse. Oh, the louse. Pediculus humanus corporis. The body louse, the single most universally hated and intimately familiar companion of every soldier on every front of the First World War. By 1916, it was estimated that 95% of British infantrymen who had served at the front for more than a month were infested. There was no avoiding it. Lice lived in the seams of your tunic, in the waistband of your trousers, in the folds of your greatcoat. They laid their eggs in the stitching. They fed on you in the night. They itched. God, did they itch? So the men waged a small, grim, daily war on them. The practice was universally called chatting, because you did it with company, sitting in a circle, half-dressed, running a lit candle slowly along the inside seams of your shirt. When the flame reached a louse, it went off with a tiny, satisfying pop. Hours could be spent this way, entire afternoons. Men chatted while they gossiped, while they sang, while they wrote letters home. The British Army eventually issued Harrison's pomade, a pale, waxy, foul-smelling preparation that was supposed to kill the little beasts. It didn't particularly, but it made the men smell like a chemist's shop, which the lice seemed to find only mildly annoying. Delousing stations sprang up behind the lines, great steam laundries where your uniform went in infested and came out for approximately 6 hours clean. Then you went back up to the trenches and it all started again. Now, given all of this, given the universal hatred, the itching, the pops, the endless chatting, what did the men do with the lice they captured? Obviously, the same thing they did with the rats. They raced them. Louse racing, I must tell you firmly, was not a joke. It was a formal, organized, widely practiced trench pastime, with rules, stakes, and in some cases actual bookmakers. The general procedure was as follows. Each participant would capture his best louse, the largest, the fastest, the most energetic specimen he could find, and mark it with a tiny dab of iodine or ink or a carefully scraped dot of paint to identify it. The lice would then be placed in the center of an upturned tin plate or mess tin. A coin would be placed around the rim as a finish line. The first louse to cross the coin won. Bets were placed on the outcome. The betting could get serious. In quiet sectors, men wagered cigarettes, bootlaces, chocolate, silver francs, and, in one recorded case from an Australian unit at Gallipoli, a genuinely distressing amount of a week's pay. The Australian diggers, it must be said, took louse racing more seriously than perhaps anyone else. There are accounts of full Gallipoli stakes held with a stopwatch, an appointed steward, a chalkboard of odds, and a gentleman acting as bookmaker who kept ledgers in a notebook. Names of winning lice were remembered. Grudge matches were arranged. Officers were known to slip down the line and place discreet bets on lice owned by their NCOs, though this was technically beneath them. On the German side, the Bavarians developed a fondness for racing large cockchafer beetles instead, which they found somewhat more dignified. The French occasionally raced ants. In the Sinai campaign, soldiers of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force staged scorpion versus spider fights in upturned helmets, which is exactly as unsettling as it sounds, and which officers officially disapproved of while unofficially, frequently attending. Human beings will, it turns out, bet on absolutely anything that moves, up to and including a parasite they have personally extracted from their own armpit. And yet, and here's the quiet beauty of it, for the few minutes while a race was going on, the war stopped. 4 or 5 men would be bent over a tin plate, heads almost touching, breath held, watching a tiny brown speck move an inch across a greasy surface. A whisper, a grunt, someone's louse wins, someone else hands over a cigarette. Quiet laughter. Nobody is thinking about the Kaiser, or the general's staff, or the shell that landed last night 40 yards from the dugout. There is just the plate, the coin, and the louse. The menagerie didn't stop at mammals and parasites, of course. Homing pigeons, officially military assets, became unofficial pets as well. Men would sit with a bird on their knee for hours, feeding it scraps, talking to it softly, before finally tying a message to its leg and sending it off. One of them, a pigeon called Cher Ami, American-trained, French-named, was hit by a bullet that shattered her leg, took out one eye, and passed straight through her breast, and she still flew 25 miles back to divisional headquarters with a message that saved the lost battalion of the 77th Division in October 1918. She is also now stuffed, also in the Smithsonian, standing near Stubby. They are, very quietly, colleagues. There was Nicholas, the Siamese cat, smuggled ashore at Gallipoli in the pocket of an Anzac officer who survived the whole campaign and came home to Australia in someone's kit bag. There was a French Alpine regiment that adopted an entire herd of goats and refused to give them up. There was a British trench on the Somme that kept a tame magpie named Jack, who stole bright objects from officers and hid them in a crack above a dugout entrance, and who, when the unit rotated out, was left behind only because nobody could catch him. And late at night, in the candlelit dugout with your 4 companions, there is a soft sound coming from the corner. It is Winston the rat, in his biscuit tin cage, standing on his back legs, front paws pressed together, eyes very bright, waiting for another crumb of beef. The man who tamed him, a clerk from Sheffield before the war, is speaking to him in the low, affectionate voice you might use with a toddler. Across the dugout, on an upturned ammunition crate, 3 other men are bent over a tin plate, each with a louse at the ready. Bets are being placed in whispers. The sergeant, who is supposed to disapprove of this, is not looking. The sergeant, in fact, has placed his own bet. The candle flickers. Outside, the guns grumble politely, a long way off, as though they too are taking the evening off to watch. For 10 minutes? For 20? For an hour? Nobody on this particular small square of muddy earth is at war with anybody. They are at war with a louse named Hector, and he has just nosed ahead of a louse named Gladys. And A man from Oldham is punching the air in silent triumph, while another man from Sunderland quietly hands him a cigarette. It is, when you think about it, one of the tenderest things human beings have ever done with a parasite. And when the race is over, and the winner's pocketed, and Winston has curled up to sleep on a folded scarf, the men drift back to their other occupations. Someone picks up his brass shell casing and resumes his tapping. Someone else reaches under his blanket for a battered notebook and a stub of pencil. Because if there is one thing the trench soldier loved almost as much as his tame rat and his painted louse, it was writing things down. And he loved writing things down almost indecently much. If you had taken a census of the British Expeditionary Force in, say, the spring of 1917, and asked every man what he had in his pack that was not strictly government issue, you would have received a broadly predictable list: a photograph, a letter, a pencil, a notebook. The pencil and the notebook in particular were nearly universal. The First World War was, among the many other things it was, the most thoroughly documented conflict the human race had ever managed up to that point. Not by journalists, not by historians, not by official war artists, but by ordinary, muddy, sleep-deprived men, scribbling in the margins of army-issue stationery by the light of a guttering candle. The scale of it is almost impossible to grasp. Historians now estimate that somewhere over 400 distinct trench newspapers were produced during the war. 400. British, French, German, Australian, Canadian, South African, New Zealander, one beautiful little hand-drawn sheet from a Russian prisoner of war camp in East Prussia, scratched out on the back of German food parcel labels. Some ran for a single issue. Some ran for the entire length of the war. Some were professionally typeset on salvaged presses. Most were mimeographed, which is to say duplicated with a smelly purple ink on whatever paper the adjutant had failed to lock up, including, in more than one documented case, the blank reverse side of official ration forms. And the flagship of them all, the one everyone knows if they know any at all, was the Wipers Times. The story of the Wipers Times is the kind of story that, if you invented it, a sensible editor would ask you to make it slightly less charming. In February 1916, the 12th Battalion of the Sherwood Foresters, ordinary Nottinghamshire infantrymen, not journalists, not printers, were picking their way through the shattered ruins of Ypres. The city had been shelled into its constituent atoms. And there, in the cellar of what had once been a newspaper office, they found a printing press, battered, dusty, missing a few letters, but genuinely, functionally, a printing press. They had no instructions. Nobody had told them what to do with a printing press. So they did what any reasonable group of bored infantrymen would do. They stole it. They wheeled it carefully back toward the support lines. And under the editorship of Captain Fred Roberts and Lieutenant Jack Pearson, neither of whom had ever produced a newspaper in their lives, they began, from February 1916, to print a satirical magazine. They named it the Wipers Times, after the British Tommy's cheerful mispronunciation of Ypres, because saying Ypres was considered frankly above one's station. Later, as the battalion moved sectors, the paper was renamed the New Church Times, then the Kemmel Times, then the Somme Times, then the BEF Times, which is rather like renaming your band every time you move house. The content stayed roughly the same. Ferocious, dry, entirely British satire aimed at everything in sight. The advertisements, which were fake, are still genuinely funny a century later. For sale, one slightly used periscope, one careful owner only used to observe Jerry on alternate Tuesdays. Apply Box 9. No reasonable offer refused. Estate agents offered desirable residence, the Ypres salient, south-facing, bracing air, uninterrupted views of the enemy, some minor structural damage. The paper ran a regular parody war correspondent column by a man named Bellery Helloc, a sideways jab at the pompous popular historian Hilaire Belloc, whose strategic predictions from the safety of his London club were the running joke of every dugout on the Western Front. There was an agony aunt column, signed Intelligence Officer, which answered letters from distressed readers whose socks had been eaten by rats or whose sergeants had developed feelings. There were fake horoscopes. Gemini. Today you will find a decent dry sock. Do not question this blessing. Enjoy. It was genuinely very good. It is still in print today if you want a copy, which tells you something about its quality. The French produced their own versions, dozens of them, with the particular dry gallows wit of the poilu. Le poilu, l'écho des marmites, the echo of the shells, which is the kind of title that only works in French. Le rire aux éclats, le canard des poilus. They were mimeographed in abandoned farmhouses, typeset on stolen equipment, or, more often, hand-copied and passed along. One enterprising French editor, when paper ran short, solved the problem by printing on the back of requisition forms the quartermaster had not yet missed. The Germans, being German, were more orderly about it. Their trench newspapers, known collectively as Schützengrabenzeitungen, a word which, like most German words, sounds exactly like what it describes, included Die Sappe and De Drahtverhau, which translates roughly as the barbed wire entanglement, and which is, once again, the kind of title that absolutely refuses to be funny in translation. These papers blended poetry, cartoons, weather complaints, and grim jokes about the food. Everyone, on every side, complained about the food. If there was one universal topic of trench journalism, it was the rations. The content types were astonishing in their variety. Limericks, acrostics, battlefield crosswords, where 4 across was a small explosive device, affectionately known, and the answer was whiz-bang. Fake adverts, letters to the editor from fictional generals, comic strips drawn by men who had been cartoonists before the war and would be again if they made it. There were running joke characters. There were feuds between rival trench papers. There were, inevitably, complaints about other trench papers, which is the most reassuringly human thing journalism has ever done. And underneath all of this, woven through every issue, there was poetry. We think of the war poets now as a set of formal literary figures, their names chiseled into university reading lists, their photographs hanging in solemn black and white. But that is not how they started. They started as hobbyists, men with a pencil stub and a notebook and an idea, scribbling in a dugout at 2 a.m. because the shelling had stopped and something inside them had not. Wilfred Owen, the name most of us know, wrote Dulce et decorum est, not at the front, but in a hospital bed. October 1917, Craig Lockhart War Hospital in Edinburgh, where he had been sent to recover from what they called shell shock and what we would, more honestly, call the natural human consequence of being buried alive by a shell at Savvy Wood. He was 24. He was, by his own quiet admission, a mediocre poet before the war. Then he met Siegfried Sassoon at Craig Lockhart, who had been sent there as a kind of polite punishment for publishing a public protest against the continuation of the war, and the two of them sat together in a convalescent hospital in Scotland, working on drafts of what are now considered some of the finest poems in the English language. Owen would return to the front. He would die on November 4th, 1918, crossing the Sambre-Waux Canal, 7 days before the armistice. His mother received the telegram while the church bells were ringing for the end of the war. Siegfried Sassoon, who survived, carried a notebook throughout his frontline service and wrote verses in pencil, often quite literally in the trench, leaning against the revetment. The Old Huntsman, Counter-Attack, the poems that made him famous. All of them were first drafts scrawled in the margins of an officer's field notebook that was supposed to be used for reporting the condition of the wire. Isaac Rosenberg, a working-class Jewish painter from Stepney who enlisted because he needed the money and because the army would feed him, composed Break of Day in the Trenches while on sentry duty in June 1916, stood at the fire step in the grey light before dawn, a rat running along the parapet at his feet, and a poem, a genuinely great poem, shaping itself in his head. He would scribble lines onto scraps of paper and send them in letters home to the critic Edward Marsh, asking rather humbly whether they were any good. They were. He was killed on the 1st of April 1918. On the German side, Ernst Junger filled private diaries with a cool, terrifying, beautiful prose that would later become Storm of Steel. August Stram, a poet and post office worker, developed a telegraphic style, single words, hammered onto the page like rifle fire, that was decades ahead of anything the literary world was doing. He was killed in 1915 near Horodek, in what is now Belarus, and his papers came home in a small parcel to his widow. But for every Owen, for every Rosenberg, for every Stram, there were, and this is the part we tend to forget, millions of ordinary men keeping ordinary diaries. Millions. Private soldiers in every army who wrote every day in small, cheap notebooks about the weather, the food, the rumours, the cards lost at Nap, the number of lice caught and killed, the health of a particular rat, the contents of a parcel from home. Most of these diaries were never published. Most of them are still sitting, quietly, in shoeboxes, in attics in Derbyshire and Bavaria and Queensland, passed down through families who have mostly forgotten what they are. A few of them, once in a while, surface. There is the case of Harry Lamin, an ordinary British private from Derbyshire, a lace worker before the war, 30 years old, married, 2 children, who wrote letters home in a careful, slightly formal, entirely lovely handwriting. Nothing spectacular, just the small news. The weather was bad. Thank Connie for the socks. The rum ration had been good. He was alive. He was alive. 100 years after the war, a great-grandson typed his letters up, one by one, and posted them to the internet as a blog on the exact 100th anniversary of each letter's writing. Strangers began to read them, then thousands of strangers, then hundreds of thousands. A man who had never, in life, been noticed by anybody outside his village became, a century later, a quiet internet celebrity, read daily by people who had been born 60 years after his death. He had written, without knowing it, into the future. And letter writing itself was a hobby of truly absurd scale. Some men wrote 20, 30, even 40 letters a day. Not because there was nothing to do, although, as we have established, there was very little to do, but because it was the thread connecting them to the world they had left. a man might maintain running correspondences with his mother, his sisters, his aunts, his old schoolmaster, his fiancée, his vicar, his employer, and, in more than a few documented and delicately embarrassing cases, several fiancés at once who were under the mistaken but firmly held impression that they were the only one. The trench system, with its slow but astonishingly reliable military post, made all of this possible. A letter written in a dugout on Tuesday could be on a kitchen table in Leeds by Friday. It is, when you think about it, faster than most modern human communication is allowed to feel. And when a man simply did not have the energy or the words or the hope, there was the field service postcard. The famous pre-printed card, issued by the million, with a set of statements you could keep or strike out. I am quite well. I have been admitted to hospital, sick, wounded, and am going on well. I am being sent down to the base. I have received your letter, parcel, telegram. Letter follows at first opportunity. I have received no letter from you lately, for a long time. You struck out what did not apply. You added nothing. You were, in fact, forbidden to add anything, on pain of the card being destroyed. You signed and posted, and at home, your mother saw the envelope and knew before she opened it that you were alive, because you had written. And yet, and here is where hobbyists will always find a way, men developed clandestine codes within even this. A particular phrase left unstruck might mean one thing to a sister and another to a wife. The placement of a smudge, the particular angle of a signature, an underline where none was needed. A whole secret language of postcards, spoken only between the man and the person to whom he was writing, hidden in plain sight inside the most rigid bureaucratic form the army could devise. Men, given a box, will always invent a way to decorate the box. And so, in your candlelit dugout on the 4th of November, 1915, the fourth man, the one we have not yet properly visited, has reached under his blanket and brought out a battered notebook. The cover is soft with damp. The pages are foxed. He licks the tip of a pencil stub, a gesture he has probably made 10,000 times in his life, and he begins to write. Perhaps it is a letter to a girl in Derbyshire. Perhaps it is a limerick for next week's trench paper. Perhaps it is simply a few lines, for himself, describing the smell of the mist coming off the duckboards and the sound of Winston the rat breathing in his sleep. He does not know that he is writing into history. He does not know that his great-grandchildren, not yet born, will find this notebook in a box. He does not know that a century from now, someone will be reading his words aloud in the dark to help a stranger go to sleep. He just writes, because the candle is still burning, because there is paper, because there is a pencil, and because, somehow, putting words down on a page is a way of staying alive. And when he has finished writing, when the pencil is put down and the notebook is closed and tucked back under the blanket, he will yawn and stretch and glance across the dugout, where, from somewhere further down the line, he can hear music, very faint, a piano, perhaps, a man singing in a high, surprisingly sweet voice, someone laughing, because somewhere, a few hundred yards back, behind the reserve line, in a barn with a leaking tin roof, another kind of hobby is in full, riotous swing. That barn, with its leaking tin roof and its piano and its improbably sweet-voiced singer, is not a hallucination. It is not a morale-boosting fantasy dreamt up by a man who has been in the line too long. It is, In fact, an entirely real and entirely documented feature of life behind the Western Front, and it has a name. It is a concert party. And concert parties, by the middle years of the war, had become one of the most beloved, most attended, and most genuinely strange institutions the British Army had ever produced. Almost every division, by 1916, had raised its own troop. The 4th Division had the Follies. The 6th Division had the Fancies. The 50th Division had the Whiz-Bangs, named, with the dark humour characteristic of the era, after the particular kind of German shell that gave you no warning whatsoever before it killed you. The 20th Division had the very lights, after the flares that lit up no man's land at night. The New Zealanders had the Kiwis. The Australians had the Anzac Coves, which is the kind of pun that should really not work, and somehow absolutely does. And then, most famously of all, there was the Dumbbells. The Dumbbells were a Canadian troop, raised in August of 1917 by Captain Merton Plunkett of the 3rd Canadian Division. Plunkett was, by all accounts, one of those natural showmen that every generation produces. A man who could organise anything, who could talk anybody into anything, and who had, before the war, been working for the YMCA in small-town Ontario. He assembled a group of soldiers with musical and theatrical talent, borrowed a piano, found some costumes, and began touring the Canadian sector. Within a year, they were performing to audiences of 2,000 and 3,000 men at a time in purpose-built wooden theatres, and they were, frankly, the most successful thing the 3rd Canadian Division had ever produced. And that is saying something, because the 3rd Canadian Division had also taken Vimy Ridge. The venues were extraordinary. Sometimes the concert parties performed in barns, proper peasant barns, with hay bales for seating and cows occasionally wandering in from the adjacent stall. Sometimes they performed in shell-damaged churches, which is an image that will stay with you. A man in a dress, singing a comic song about the rations under a roof with a hole in it, in a building that had, 3 weeks previously, been a functioning house of God. And sometimes, when the unit was lucky and the war was giving them a few months in a quiet sector, they performed in proper purpose-built wooden theatres. The most famous of these was at Poperinghe, a small Belgian town a few miles behind Ypres, which, because of its position, became the unofficial rest and recreation capital of the British sector. Poperinghe had a theatre. It had cinemas. It had cafes. It had, and this is historically important, several establishments that sold genuinely drinkable wine. A soldier sent back to Poperinghe for a week of rest was a soldier who had, briefly, been returned to something very like civilization. The material performed was, to modern ears, both entirely familiar and entirely alien. There were comic songs, by the hundred, lifted from the music halls of London and Manchester, and rewritten with topical lyrics. There were ragtime numbers, which were the absolute height of fashion at the time, and which the troops performed with an enthusiasm that should embarrass anyone who thinks of the Great War as a purely sepia-toned affair. There were patriotic finales, obligatory, expected, sometimes deeply felt, and sometimes performed with a faintly raised eyebrow. And there were topical sketches. Oh, the topical sketches. The sketches are where the real voice of the trenches comes through, because the sketches were, almost without exception, about mocking the general staff, mocking the rations, mocking the incompetence of the supply corps. mocking the French peasants who overcharged you for a bottle of cheap wine, mocking the English padre who insisted on preaching about cleanliness to men who had been in the same socks for 5 weeks, and, above all, mocking the absurdity of the entire situation they had all somehow found themselves in. The officers, to their enormous credit, mostly sat in the front rows and laughed along. In many cases, they laughed at themselves. There is a particular kind of officer, the good kind, the one his men would follow through anything, who understands that being mocked by his troops in song, with rhymes and everything, is in fact one of the highest forms of professional compliment. And then we come to the costumes, and to the question of the women. Because here is the practical problem. A concert party wants to put on variety entertainment. Variety entertainment in 1916 means music hall sketches. Music hall sketches in 1916 require female characters. There are, in the British sector of the Western Front, almost no actual women. There are nurses, there are voluntary aid detachment workers, there are the occasional astonishing visiting celebrities, but they are not available to join your division's theatre troupe on a regular basis. And so, the soldiers did what soldiers in virtually every army in history have done when called upon to produce theatre without women. They put on dresses. The female impersonators of the First World War are a chapter of theatrical history that deserves, quite genuinely, far more attention than it gets. These men were not performing in quotation marks. They were not doing a joke version of femininity, or at least not always. Many of them were superb performers, with real falsetto voices and real stage presence and real comedic timing, and the audiences did not laugh at them. The audiences swooned. The most famous of them all was Ross Hamilton, the principal female impersonator of the Dumbbells, who performed under the stage name Marjorie. Ross Hamilton was, by every contemporary account, stunning. He had a clear, sweet falsetto. He had graceful movement. He had the kind of stage charisma that people pay money for. When he stood up on a rickety wooden stage in a barn outside Arras and sang, "I Know Where the Flies Go," in the winter-time, in a blonde wig and a silk dress that had once been someone's drawing-room curtain, there are documented accounts, real accounts, from grown men writing in letters home to their wives, of entire audiences of mud-caked, exhausted, battle-numbed soldiers sitting in complete silence with tears running down their faces. Because for 2 minutes, for the length of one sentimental song, Marjorie was not a man in a dress. Marjorie was every woman they had left behind. Marjorie was home. Marjorie was the thing the war was trying to take from them, standing on a stage and looking lovely. The costumes themselves were a minor miracle of improvisation. Parachute silk, when parachutes became available later in the war, was an absolute treasure. Light, drapeable, and easily dyed. Curtains from abandoned or damaged French chateaux were requisitioned with varying degrees of official blessing and transformed into evening gowns. Jewellery was made from battered tin, with glass beads and the occasional genuine piece of salvaged costume jewellery liberated from a ruined shop. Wigs were the hardest challenge. One famous concert party was said to have acquired its prize wig, long, blonde, and miraculously real, from a widow in Paris who had donated her own hair after the death of her husband, on the grounds that, if there was to be any joy in the world, the soldiers should have it. That wig, reportedly, was insured and transported between performances in a special padded case. The Germans had their own version. The front theatre, they called it, and it was just as popular in the German trenches as the concert parties were in the British. Companies with names like Eulenspiegel, after the medieval jester, and Lustige Blätter, meaning merry pages, toured with portable stages and accordion accompaniment, and much the same material. Comic songs, topical sketches, sentimental ballads, men in dresses. The French had a more formal arrangement, the Théâtre aux Armées, the theatre at the armies, which was organised under government patronage and sent genuine professional actresses to the front, real women, on stages, within earshot of the artillery. The most astonishing of these was Sarah Bernhardt. Sarah Bernhardt at this point was 72 years old. She had, in 1915, had her right leg amputated above the knee after an injury sustained 20 years earlier refused to heal. She was, arguably, the most famous actress in the world. And she toured the French front on one leg, performing scenes from her greatest roles from a specially constructed chair to audiences of poilus who had walked miles through the mud to see her. She is said to have performed the death scene from La Dame aux Camélias, so close to the front lines that the shelling provided, unintentionally, the sound effects. That is a level of professional commitment that should humble, quite frankly, everybody. And then, tucked into all of this, was Talbot House. Talbot House was not, strictly speaking, a theatre. It was founded in December 1915 in Poperingi by an army chaplain named Philip Clayton, who was universally known as Tubby, because he was. Tubby Clayton took over a large empty house in the centre of town, hung a sign over the door reading, "All rank abandon, ye who enter here," and created a rest house where, for the first time in most of their military service, a soldier could walk in as a human being instead of as a number. At Talbot House, a private and a general drank the same tea at the same table. There was a chapel in the attic. There was a library. There was a garden. There were debating societies. There were chess nights. There were, of course, amateur dramatic performances. There was, for one blessed shilling, a bed that was not made of muddy planks and did not contain any lice. Tens of thousands of men passed through Talbot House during the war. Many of them said it saved their sanity. Some of them said it saved their lives. The house is still there in Poperinge, still open, still welcoming visitors, and the sign over the door still reads, "All rank abandon, ye who enter here," which is, I think, one of the most quietly beautiful sentences ever written on a piece of wood. The soldier entertainers themselves came in every flavour you can imagine. There were amateur magicians with packs of cards carried through campaigns from Mons to the armistice. There were ventriloquists with dummies carved from broom handles and dressed in miniature uniforms. There were amateur operatic tenors, which, it turns out, every regiment had at least one of, and which produced the frankly magical experience of an entire barn full of muddy infantrymen falling silent while a private from Birmingham sang Nessun Dorma by candlelight. There were comedy double acts. There were impressionists specializing in Kaiser impressions, which never stopped being funny, apparently, for 4 entire years. And yes, I should mention honestly that there were also minstrel acts, because this was 1916, and the casual racism of the early 20th century was absolutely present in these troops. And it is worth saying plainly that the affection we feel for these men and for what they achieved does not require us to pretend they were modern in every respect. They were not. They were of their time, and their time, in this as in so many other things, had a great deal to answer for. The sensory experience of a concert party is worth closing on, because it is, I think, one of the most extraordinary moments of the entire war that nobody ever puts in the films. Imagine it. You have walked 4 miles from the reserve line, in the rain, in boots that are more water than boot. You are cold. You have not been properly warm in 4 months. You have not laughed at anything in perhaps 2 weeks. You push through the door of a barn, and inside there are 300 other men, and the smell hits you at once. Unwashed wool uniforms, wet leather, pipe tobacco, candle smoke, a strange sharp note of chloride of lime from the delousing station next door, and under all of it, incongruously, the bright, fake floral smell of grease paint. At the front of the barn there is a stage made of packing crates. There are carbide footlights hissing softly. There is a piano somehow improbably in tune. And when the curtain, which is an army blanket on a length of signal wire, is pulled back, there stands Marjorie in a parachute silk gown, in a blonde wig that was once a Parisian widow's grief. And she smiles, and she opens her mouth, and she begins to sing. And 300 men who have spent the morning in a trench, and who will spend tomorrow morning in a trench, go absolutely and completely still. Because for 2 minutes and 40 seconds, in the year of our Lord 1916, the war is not happening. It is possibly the most moving thing any of them have ever seen. Certainly after, when they walk back through the rain to the reserve line, in the dark, in small, quiet groups, not one of them is talking about the shells. They are humming very softly about where the flies go in the winter-time. And the dumbbells, when the war ended, did not stop. Captain Plunkett brought them home, and they toured Canada professionally for a full decade. They became, for a while, one of the most popular entertainment acts in the country. Ross Hamilton, Marjorie, continued to perform as a woman on Canadian stages throughout the 1920s, to rapturous audiences, many of whom were themselves veterans, and who had first seen him sing in a barn in France, while the rain hissed on a tin roof, and the guns muttered softly a few miles to the east. And humming, it turns out, was not the only thing soldiers did to keep the war at bay. They also played. They played constantly. They played obsessively. They played in ways that, when you stop and actually think about it for a moment, border on the deranged, because some of the most famous games of the First World War were played not behind the lines, not in the safety of a billet, but out there, in the mud, within rifle shot of the people who were actively trying to kill them. Let's begin with the single most famous game in military history, the Christmas truce of 1914. You have almost certainly heard of it. You have probably seen the John Lewis advert. What you may not know is how much of it was, in fact, real, and how much of it was later romantic embroidery, and where, in particular, the football comes in. The truces happened. That is documented in hundreds of soldiers' letters on both sides. Along substantial sections of the Western Front, from Christmas Eve into Christmas Day of 1914, British and German soldiers stopped shooting at each other, met in no man's land, exchanged buttons and tobacco and tins of bully beef, sang carols, buried each other's dead, and shook hands. It was not universal, it was not coordinated, and it was quietly furious-making for the generals on both sides, who spent the next 4 Christmases making very sure it did not happen again. And yes, in at least one place, the soldiers did kick a football. Near Frelinghien, opposite the trenches of the 133rd Royal Saxon Regiment, a Lieutenant Johannes Niemann later wrote in his memoirs that a ball appeared from somewhere, nobody quite knew where, and a match was organised between the Saxons and the Scotsmen opposite. Niemann remembered the final score as 3-2 in favour of the Germans. He also remembered, with some amusement, that the Scotsmen were wearing kilts and that the wind on Christmas Day was, shall we say, informative. Whether the match was as tidy and organised as that sounds, or whether it was, as seems more likely, a chaotic kickabout involving dozens of men and an improvised ball made from a ration tin wrapped in string, depends on which account you read. But something happened. A ball was kicked. 2 armies stopped, briefly being armies, and became instead a slightly damp under-12s fixture in an exceptionally cold field. If the 1914 football match is semi-legendary, Captain Wilfred Neville's footballs are not. Captain Wilfred Percy Neville, known to his men as Billy, of the 8th Battalion East Surrey Regiment, did something at 6 o'clock in the morning on the 1st of July 1916 at the opening of the Battle of the Somme that has never quite stopped being astonishing. He had, during the previous home leave, purchased 4 footballs. He had distributed 1 to each of his 4 platoons, and when the whistles blew and his men climbed out of the trenches to walk across no man's land toward the German wire, Captain Neville kicked one of those footballs ahead of them and offered a prize to the first platoon that could kick its football into the German front-line trench. He was killed within the first few minutes of the attack. Most of his battalion was killed or wounded with him, but 2 of the 4 footballs were recovered afterward, and they survive, quiet and deflated, and very strange to look at in museums in England today. One is at the Queen's Royal Surrey Regiment Museum. One is at the National Army Museum. They sit in their glass cases, looking like the ordinary, slightly battered leather footballs you might have kicked around a park as a child, which is, of course, exactly what they are. The fact that a man thought genuinely that it would help his men to walk into machine gun fire if there was a football rolling ahead of them tells you something about the psychology of 1916 that no history book can quite get across. Once you move back from the front line into the reserve areas, football becomes almost absurdly organised. Inter-battalion leagues, brigade cup competitions, divisional finals, championship trophies forged in several documented cases from the melted-down brass of shell fragments, hammered into rough cup shapes by regimental armourers and engraved with the names of the winning units. The 17th Middlesex, known as the Footballers' Battalion because it was recruited specifically from professional players, included several pre-war England internationals, and when they played properly. Professional league referees in uniform, regulation 90 minutes, linesmen, the whole apparatus, in a cow pasture, 3 miles from the guns. Cricket, being cricket, was of course also present. The most astonishing cricket match of the war was played on Shell Green at Gallipoli in December 1915 by men of the Australian 2nd Division a few days before the evacuation. They played in full view of the Turkish lines, and the Turks, being able to see them perfectly clearly, did what any sensible enemy would do, which was to occasionally lob a shell at them. The match continued. A shell burst near the crease. A batsman played on. The photographs survive, and they are genuinely remarkable. Men in slouch hats and shorts playing cricket on a dusty beach, while puffs of artillery smoke bloom in the distance. Rifle cases were used as bats. A makeshift ball was improvised from whatever could be persuaded to bounce. The Anzacs, it has been observed, took cricket extremely seriously, and they took the Turks at that particular moment slightly less so. Beyond football and cricket, there were brigade sports days. These were organised, regular, and taken with the kind of solemn seriousness that only the British Army could bring to a sack race. There were tug-of-war contests between regiments, with entire battalions turning out to cheer. There were running races, high jumps, three-legged races, wheelbarrow races. There were horse shows put on by the cavalry regiments, complete with ribbons and rosettes, even during periods when the horses themselves were visibly starving, which added a note of heartbreak to the judging. Boxing was enormous. Jimmy Wilde, the Welsh flyweight who was probably the finest pound-for-pound boxer in the world at that time, gave exhibitions behind the lines. Gene Tunney, who would later become heavyweight champion of the world, boxed for the United States Marines. For a private soldier, a good boxing match on a Saturday evening, in a barn with a rope and sandbag ring, was not a minor entertainment. It was the entertainment. And then there were the quieter games, the ones that happened inside the dugouts, where the real and constant entertainment of the war took place on a wooden ammunition crate in the light of a candle stub with a deck of cards. Card games were universal. The British played brag and pontoon and nap. The French played belote, which they took extremely seriously, and which is still played in French villages today, in essentially the form that was perfected in the dugouts of the poilus. The Germans played skat, which they took even more seriously than the French took belote, which is saying something. Skat societies, formal ones, with rules and rankings and officially recorded matches, sprang up in prisoner-of-war camps and in reserve lines, and several of the great skat clubs of interwar Germany traced their origins directly to a particular dugout on a particular stretch of the Western Front. The king of all trench games, however, was Crown and Anchor. Crown and Anchor was a dice game, officially and firmly banned by the British Army, because it was quick, addictive, and ran on money, and therefore played enthusiastically and constantly by every other private in the British Expeditionary Force. The board was simple. 6 symbols, a crown, an anchor, and the 4 card suits, chalked onto the back of an ammunition crate or painted on a square of canvas. 3 dice, each marked with the same symbols instead of numbers. You placed your money on a symbol. If the dice came up showing that symbol, you were paid out. If they did not, the banker, who was always running a small private fortune on the side, kept your money. The banker, in trench slang, was the spieler, and the spielers of the First World War were among the richest private soldiers who ever walked out of a war. Their technique of patter, the rhythmic sing-song of "Come to the lucky old crown, sir, come to the lucky old anchor," was so distinctive that veterans could recognize an old crown and anchor man in Civvy Street 30 years later. Chess was played too, quietly, and in some cases famously. The 5th Gordon Highlanders maintained in 1916 what was known as the Great Chess Ladder, a running tournament in which every officer and many of the senior NCOs were ranked, and challenges were played in spare moments, sometimes across multiple days, with the board carefully covered with a cloth between sessions. There are at least 2 documented cases, and probably more, of chess games played between British and German lines using improvised signalling. A man on the British side would make his move, call the notation loudly over the parapet, and wait, while, across 50 yards of wire, a man on the German side moved the corresponding piece on his own board and called back his reply. These were quiet sectors, obviously. Nobody was playing chess across the parapet at Passchendaele. But in the cabbage field stillness of a dull winter watch, 2 bored men with boards and pieces, and enough German or English between them, could, it turns out, find each other. There was also a game called housey. It was played with numbered cards and small drawn tokens, often dried beans because beans were plentiful, and a caller who would pull numbers from a bag and sing them out in an elaborate patter. The soldier who completed a row first called house and took the pot. You will already have recognized this game, because housey after the war came home with the soldiers, filtered into British and American popular culture through the 1920s and 1930s, and is now, with slight modifications and a more family-friendly name, one of the most popular games in the English-speaking world. Every time you hear someone shout bingo in a church hall, you are, very faintly, hearing the ghost of a Tommy calling 2 fat ladies, 88 in a candlelit barn in Flanders. I want to close on the sound of all of this. Because the sound of a trench on a quiet evening, when the guns were murmuring only softly in the distance, was not silence. It was a layered, surprisingly domestic soundscape. There was the slap of cards hitting wet ammunition crate wood. There was the rattle of dice in a battered mess tin. There was the soft, involuntary whistle of a watching soldier when a good chess move was made. There was laughter. There was swearing. There was the occasional yelp of the man who had just lost a week's pay to the Crown and Anchor banker. There was, from the next dugout, the faint wheezing of a gramophone. And there was, from a pasture half a mile back, across the dim and rainy fields, the unmistakable, ordinary, heart-stopping sound of men cheering a goal. Somewhere under a torn grey sky, in a battered cow field, 22 muddy men in improvised kit were playing football. A referee was consulting a borrowed wristwatch, and a crowd of their friends was standing around in the drizzle, stamping their feet for warmth and shouting the same things that men have shouted at football matches for as long as there have been football matches. And a few miles to the east, a gun battery was ranging very gently on a crossroads. And the 2 sounds, the cheers and the guns, mingled in the wet air and became, for a minute, a single strange noise, the noise of an entire generation of young men trying stubbornly and tenderly and with a great deal of spit and tape to stay alive in all the ways that mattered. Which brings us, rather naturally, to what they did when they wanted to grow something out of all that mud. Because yes, they did that too. They grew things. On the edge of the worst man-made landscape in human history, in soil that had been turned over so many times by high explosive that it had the texture of a churned pudding, ordinary soldiers quietly, stubbornly, and in very large numbers decided that what the trench really needed was a row of radishes. I find this one of the most genuinely moving hobbies of the entire war, and I find it moving not because it is surprising, but because it is so utterly, unmistakably human. Put a man in a hole. Give him a spare half hour. Give him a scrap of sunlight and a pinch of soil that isn't actively on fire. He will, within a week, be trying to grow a lettuce in it. The practice was widespread, and it was not an eccentric little oddity confined to one or two reserve sectors. From about the spring of 1915, right through to the end of the war, British, French, German and Commonwealth soldiers all along the Western Front planted small, optimistic gardens on the tops of sandbags, in the walls of communication trenches, on the roofs of dugouts, and in any patch of rear area churn that could be coaxed into a semblance of earth. They planted lettuces because lettuces are fast and forgiving. They planted radishes because radishes will put up with almost anything. They planted spring onions, parsley, chives. And because a man growing food will, within about 3 days, start growing something just to look at, they planted flowers, pansies, marigolds, cornflowers, poppies, which needed very little planting at all, because Flanders was, as a poet would shortly point out, already taking care of the poppies on its own. The British trenches of 1915 through 1918 are full of these small green insurrections. Major Percy Allen of the Royal Engineers, stationed in a reserve trench near Armentières, maintained a garden so elaborate and so beloved that officers from other units would genuinely make the trip to come and look at it. It had gravel paths. The gravel paths were edged with spent brass cartridge cases stood upright like little sentinels. It had a rockery. It had, depending on which surviving letter you read, either a miniature sundial or an actual functional bird bath. And I would like to believe it was the bird bath. Major Allen was not, by any sensible metric, a man with time on his hands. He just preferred, when he did have time, to spend it weeding. And he was not unusual. The War Office, in one of those quiet, sensible decisions that real armies make when they realize morale is not going to look after itself, essentially winked at the whole thing. The Royal Horticultural Society, that most genteel of British institutions, organised seed packets to be sent to the front through the YMCA. Someone, somewhere in Vincent Square, sat down and decided that what a young man in a flooded dugout near Ypres really needed was a paper envelope of lettuce seed and a short note on how deep to sow them. They were not wrong. The French, predictably and delightfully, made a cult of it. The 56th Division, in one particularly green stretch of their reserve line, became famous throughout the French army for what the other poilus called their laitues de bataille, their battle lettuces. And they were said, in the kind of semi-serious rumour that armies love, to produce salads generous enough to share with neighbouring units. You have to picture this. A man comes off a 12-hour watch, cold, soaked, filthy, half deaf from a morning's bombardment. He walks 300 yards back through the communication trench, and his friend, a sergeant with a gardening trowel in his pack, hands him a little bowl of fresh leaves with a splash of vinaigrette. Because yes, the French were carrying vinaigrette, small personal bottles of it, tucked carefully between socks and letter paper. A nation does not abandon vinaigrette because of a war. A nation puts the vinaigrette in the pack. The Germans, for their part, went mad for flower boxes. The Bavarian infantry in particular were known throughout the German army for the elaborate little bouquets they hung outside dugout entrances, usually geraniums planted in halved shell cases or in old ammunition boxes, the red blooms nodding solemnly above the sandbag doorway like something out of a very confused Alpine postcard. A British raiding party once reported, in a mixture of bewilderment and grudging admiration, that the first German dugout they entered had a window box. A window box in a trench. With, and I promise you, this is in the report, a small watering can next to it. The real deep end of the hobby, though, the point at which trench gardening crossed a line from touching to frankly unbelievable, was beekeeping. There are, scattered through the war diaries, a small handful of documented cases of soldiers keeping bees. Not wild bees that happen to be there, actual hives, maintained, inspected, harvested. The most famous is Raoul Follereau, a French beekeeper turned soldier, who reportedly kept 2 hives running in a quiet rear area position behind the Verdun sector. The image of a man in horizon blue uniform lifting the lid off a wooden hive, while somewhere to the north, the greatest battle in French history is grinding 10 divisions into paste, is the kind of juxtaposition that feels as if it must be invented. It is not. There are several such cases. Honey at the front was essentially a luxury. A man with a hive was, briefly, a small local king. Now, if you can grow something, eventually you have to cook something. And this brings us to the next great domestic hobby of the trench, which is food. Food at the front was, by any honest reckoning, awful. For the British Tommy, it arrived in a few predictable forms. Bully beef, corned beef in a tin, salt enough to curl your teeth, and in hot weather rapidly approaching a liquid state. Makanoki stew, a ration stew of meat and vegetables sealed in a can, which was edible when hot, tolerable when warm, and, according to one veteran's memorable phrase, a man-made disaster when cold. And biscuits. The biscuits, hardtack essentially, were famous. They were so hard that the standard method of eating them was to soak them in tea for about 20 minutes, and then chew very, very carefully. One corporal is reported to have broken a tooth on one in 1917 and kept the biscuit as a souvenir for the rest of his life. Given these raw materials, soldiers did what hungry and clever people have always done, which was to improvise. Trench cookbooks, hand-copied, passed from platoon to platoon, smudged with soup and candle wax, are one of the small treasures of war museums today. They describe, in loving detail, recipes of the kind that only genuine privation can produce. Trench pudding, in many variants, was essentially whatever you had. Crumbled biscuit, a spoonful of plum and apple jam, a tot of rum, all mashed together and warmed over a candle. It was, by the accounts of the men who ate it, very nearly delicious, which is the highest praise a man knee-deep in mud can offer. Some stew was maconochia elevated, enriched with whatever you had foraged, or, let us be honest, stolen from a local farmer. A handful of leeks, a splash of vin ordinaire, a scrap of smuggled bacon. Entire unofficial cooking competitions broke out between platoons, judged by sergeants with suspiciously broad waistlines, with prizes of tobacco or extra rum. The French, of course, took cooking even more seriously than the British. For a poilu, good food was not a luxury at the front. It was a civilizational obligation. Their regimental cook, the cuistot, was a beloved figure, semi-sacred and treated, when he was any good, with the kind of reverence normally reserved for a chaplain or a particularly affectionate dog. A skilled cuistot could take the same bleak ingredients available to the British and produce something that tasted, against all reason, like dinner. The great instrument of German cooking, meanwhile, was the Feldküche, the rolling field kitchen hauled from place to place on a wagon, with a tall iron chimney that produced a very specific, very homely drift of smoke. The soldiers, with the kind of grim affection soldiers have for the things that feed them, called these kitchens Gulaschkanonen, goulash cannons, because they were built roughly on the silhouette of a field gun, and because, as any artilleryman will tell you, anything that fires hot goulash in the general direction of hungry men is, functionally, a weapon. Then there was tea. For the British soldier, tea was not a beverage. Tea was an entire philosophy, a ritual, a reason to continue living. Tea brewing rituals in the trenches were extraordinarily precise. The water, ideally, was drawn from a clean source, which in practice meant a source that had been boiled so thoroughly you had stopped asking questions. The tea, ideally, was decent loose-leaf Ceylon, smuggled where necessary, treasured everywhere. The condensed milk was non-negotiable. A Tommy handed tea without condensed milk felt genuinely, personally wronged. The tin mug was warmed. The brewing time was observed with the kind of solemn attention that men in London clubs give to port. And then, in the trench, in the rain, in the mud, in the thin grey light of another wet dawn, a man held a tin mug of sweet, milky, scalding tea, and for one moment the whole universe was genuinely all right. Beyond the tea and the stews, men grew inventive in other ways. In quiet sectors, where orchards still stood within reach of foraging parties, British and French soldiers took to home brewing. Apples were pressed or simply crushed in a jerry can, and the resulting cloudy juice was left to ferment into a rough, powerful cider, the kind of cider that will strip paint off a wall, but, poured into a mess tin on a cold night, tasted like a decent approximation of heaven. Cigarette-making, too, became its own little art. The French rolled their harsh caporal tobacco in scraps of newspaper, with the deft, absent-minded fingers of men who had been rolling their own since they were 14. The British, who had started the war primarily as pipe smokers, learned the hand-rolled cigarette from, of all people, Turkish prisoners of war at Gallipoli, and brought the habit home with them, where it quietly reshaped the smoking culture of an entire nation. A generation of British men spent their evenings in post-war pubs rolling cigarettes, the way a Turkish corporal had taught them in 1915, and probably never once thought about why. And then, and I love this one, I genuinely love this one, there was knitting. Men knitted, at the front, in dugouts, on fire steps, in hospital beds, privates, sergeants, officers. Knitting was not a female hobby that had unexpectedly wandered into a male space. It was a practical, widespread, and deeply respectable frontline activity. Wool was plentiful. Needles were easy to improvise from wire or whittled wood. Socks wore out. Fingers froze. A man who could knit could keep his own feet dry, which was not a small thing in a war where trench foot alone put tens of thousands of men out of action. Private John McCrae. Yes, that John McCrae, the Canadian doctor who would write in Flanders Fields, was among the many men who knitted in dugouts. He was not unusual. He was ordinary. Entire sock-darning clubs sprang up in convalescent wards, where nurses set wounded men to mending heel after heel as a form of gentle, patient occupational therapy. Embroidery circles, too, flourished among the recovering wounded, men with trembling hands and fragile nerves, sitting quietly over a hoop, pulling coloured thread through linen, slowly, slowly, stitching their way back towards some version of themselves. This all feels, at a distance of 100 years, slightly impossible. it should not be impossible. A man who has just returned from a raid needs, more than almost anything, to do something with his hands that does not involve a rifle. Knitting will do. Weeding a sandbag lettuce will do. Stirring a pot of Somme stew will do. And so, in the long, quiet corners of the war, across thousands of miles of trench line, on any given evening, you could have walked the parapets and seen it all laid out before you, like an extremely strange cross-section of a village. Here, a man tending radishes in the last light. There, a poilu with a bottle of vinaigrette and a bowl of leaves. There, a Bavarian corporal watering geraniums outside his dugout. There, a French regimental cook arguing passionately with a sergeant about the correct treatment of a stolen leek. There, a British private in a tin hat, a pair of improvised wooden needles in his hands, turning the heel of a grey woolen sock by the light of a guttering candle. And somewhere, quite faintly, the distant hum of bees above a wooden hive behind the lines at Verdun. Leave him there. Leave all of them there for a moment. Leave the sergeant with his radishes. As the dawn mist rises off the sandbag parapet and catches in the small green leaves, and a single bead of dew runs, very slowly, down the curve of a spring onion. And then, because the trench was never only green and tender, we turn, gently, toward the stranger corners of this world, toward the Ouija boards and the seances, toward the ghost stories and the lucky charms, toward the men who hunted souvenirs from the dead, and the nurses who pressed poppies into diaries, and the quiet, candlelit circles of soldiers asking the dark if their friends could still hear them. Because here is one of the quietly extraordinary facts about the First World War. In the middle of the most industrialized, most mechanized, most relentlessly material conflict human beings had ever managed to produce, a huge number of the men fighting it became very seriously, very sincerely interested in ghosts, spiritualism, the belief that the dead could be contacted by the living, usually through a medium, a board, or a small moving pointer on a piece of polished wood, had been knocking around Europe and America since the middle of the 19th century. It was, by 1914, a slightly unfashionable Victorian hobby, the sort of thing your great-aunt did in a velvet parlour to impress her friends. And then the war happened, and then the telegrams started arriving, and then, very quietly, very suddenly, spiritualism was not an aging parlour trick anymore. It was a mass movement, a coping strategy, a genuine, desperate, bottom-of-the-heart attempt by millions of grieving people to refuse, flatly, the idea that the boys was simply gone. From about 1915 onward, Ouija boards, planchettes, and amateur séances swept through the trenches with the unstoppable energy of a fashion that was also a need. Men who had, 6 months earlier, been perfectly content, bank clerks in Croydon were suddenly sitting in a candlelit dugout, 4 fingertips on a polished heart-shaped piece of wood, asking the dark if their dead friend could say something. Please, anything at all. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, the supposed high priest of rationalism, became during these years the most famous public advocate of spiritualism in the English-speaking world. He had lost his son Kingsley to pneumonia, contracted at the Somme in 1918. He had lost a brother. He had lost, by his own count, about a dozen close relatives. And Conan Doyle, the man who invented the most coldly logical detective in fiction, became genuinely, publicly, unapologetically convinced that the dead were speaking. His lectures drew enormous crowds, his books sold in extraordinary numbers, and his ideas drifted back to the front in letters and magazines, where soldiers copied them into dugout ritual with the earnestness of the genuinely, terribly bereaved. There were specific circles. The 1917 Ghost Circle of the 7th Royal Sussex Regiment is one of the better documented examples. A small group of soldiers who built their own planchette out of a polished tin lid and a pencil stub, and claimed over the course of several months to be in regular contact with dead comrades. Their séances were conducted, by all accounts, with complete sincerity, in a low, serious voice, in the back of a reserve dugout, with a candle burning steadily on an ammunition crate. Whether they were genuinely speaking to the dead or to the deep wells of their own grief is not really the question. What matters is that they were, in some form, speaking. Fortune-telling, in general, boomed. Cartomancy, reading fortunes from a deck of playing cards, ace of spades bringing its usual bad news, hearts bringing its usual tender hope, became an evening pastime in countless dugouts. Tea-leaf reading, already a working-class parlour tradition in Britain, was perfectly suited to the trench, where tea was abundant and tin mugs were everywhere. A soldier would drain his mug, turn it upside down on a saucer, or more likely the lid of a biscuit tin, and then let a self-appointed trench seer interpret the patterns. A ship meaning a journey home, a cross meaning trouble, a bird, well, a bird at the front, usually meant a letter. Palmistry flourished. Every battalion, it seems, had at least one soldier mystic, a man with the reputation for reading hands. Sergeant Henry Weatherly of the Australian 4th Division was, by the reports of his mates, famous across the Anzac lines, not only as a skilled palm reader, but as an eerily accurate predictor of when artillery barrages were likely to arrive. Whether this was intuition, experience, or something stranger, the men themselves seemed, for the most part, content not to inquire too closely. And then there were the superstitions. Dear God, the superstitions. The trench was a breeding ground for them, because the trench was a place in which a man could be perfectly fine one moment and cease to exist the next, for no reason discernible to ordinary cause and effect. Under those conditions, the human mind will seek patterns. It will seek rituals. It will seek, with the stubborn insistence of a species that has always done this, small private acts of control. You never lit 3 cigarettes from a single match. Never. This one was almost universal across Allied and German lines alike, and the folk logic was brutally practical. The first cigarette told a distant sniper where you were. The second let him bring his rifle to bear. The third let him fire. Whether this was actually true in ballistic terms is disputed. That every man on the Western Front believed it absolutely was not. If a match lit 2 cigarettes and a third man leaned in, the smoker would, by reflex, blow out the match and strike another. No argument, no discussion. The habit followed the survivors home. And in English pubs of the 1920s, you could still watch a veteran wordlessly shake out a match before a third smoker arrived. Lucky charms multiplied. Trench-made crucifixes, hammered out of cap badges and old coins, were carried in breast pockets. Regimental cap badges were sometimes worn inside the helmet, pressed against the forehead. Russian Orthodox chaplains distributed small silver medallions of St. George, the Dragon Slayer, to soldiers of every denomination, and those medallions ended up in the pockets of Catholics and Anglicans and Jews and nervous agnostics from Dublin to Dresden. because on the Eastern Front in 1915, nobody was feeling especially fussy about theology. Now, alongside all of this, the seances, the palms, the charms, ran another slightly darker, slightly hungrier hobby: souvenir hunting. Men collected the war, obsessively, systematically, with the kind of focused attention that, in peacetime, would have gone into collecting postage stamps or butterflies. They collected German belt buckles, the ones inscribed Gott mit uns, God with us, which had a grim and slightly absurd appeal for the Allied soldier picking one off a dead Bavarian. They collected Pickelhauben, the spiked leather helmets of the early war German infantry, which were too fragile and impractical to be of any real military use, and, as a consequence, were perfect trophies. They collected iron crosses, bayonets, bayonet scabbards, regimental buttons, cap badges, shoulder boards, and the distinctive red and white cords German soldiers wore for marksmanship. They collected Zeppelin fragments after an airship came down, sometimes arriving at the crash site within hours and stripping it to a skeleton. They collected, in a few genuinely grim cases, teeth from corpses, which were prized by some collectors because gold fillings were, well, collectors can be monstrous. A real black market in souvenirs grew up in rear area towns. Etaples and Rouen, both major base hubs for the British Expeditionary Force, developed quiet little trading networks where a frontline soldier could sell a Pickelhaube for a sum that, converted into tobacco and decent wine, genuinely improved his week. Prices fluctuated like shares on an exchange. An ordinary belt buckle was cheap. A cross of a specific class, inscribed to a specific recipient, could be expensive. An officer's dagger with unit markings could be very expensive indeed. The Australians, it must be said, had the fearsome reputation of being the most thorough, most relentless, and most alarmingly efficient souvenir hunters of the entire war. British officers would complain, with a note almost of awe, that a battlefield could be cleared by the Germans, then swept by British burial parties, and then the Australians would arrive the following afternoon and still find somehow a Luger pistol that everyone else had missed. One British colonel recorded in his diary that he had witnessed an Australian digger, within minutes of the end of a successful trench raid, methodically removing the boots from a dead German officer on the grounds that they were, and, I quote, "a nicer pair than mine, sir." Some souvenirs became famous in their own right. The naval jack of the German cruiser, SMS Emden, scuttled after her action with HMAS Sydney in November 1914 off the Cocos Islands, was taken by Australian sailors and passed over the following decades from hobbyist to hobbyist, from collection to collection, each owner adding a note to its provenance, until it became one of the most traced souvenirs of the early war. In the rear areas, amateur taxidermy bloomed. Soldiers with a country boy background would shoot a pheasant or a hare in a quiet sector, and then, astonishingly, stuff and mount it with materials improvised from wire, straw and salvaged uniform linings. One can only imagine the sergeant's reactions to a private presenting them with a slightly lopsided stuffed rabbit as a mess decoration. Apparently, for the most part, the sergeants approved. In the prisoner of war camps, the souvenir impulse turned inward, toward making rather than taking. Bavarian prisoner Karl Meinhardt, held in a British camp, produced, during his captivity, intricate scrimshaw on pieces of horsebone. fine scratched images of churches, hunting scenes, and a portrait of his wife, Gertrude, whom he would not see for 4 years. These objects too became a kind of souvenir, a souvenir of the inner life of a man trapped behind wire. Photography became, in its own quiet way, one of the great hobbies of the war, despite being officially entirely illegal in most armies. The Kodak vest pocket camera, a small folding bellows camera that fit, as its name promised, into a waistcoat pocket, was smuggled into the trenches in enormous numbers. The British Army banned it. The French Army banned it. The German Army banned it. And the soldiers, in a nearly unanimous act of quiet insubordination, banned the ban. They photographed each other in dugouts. They photographed trench lines, supply wagons, concert parties, pet dogs, comrades who were alive 1 week and dead the next. The personal photo albums that survive today, held in family attics and museum archives across Europe, were almost all produced in open violation of standing orders. Some hobbyists collected living things, or very nearly living things. Nurse Millicent Sutherland, a formidable Englishwoman of the Red Cross, who ran a hospital at Dunkirk and later near Calais, kept throughout the war a herbarium of pressed flowers. Each was mounted on paper, dated and labelled with the name of the battlefield from which it had been taken. Poppies, of course. She had a great many poppies, each one labelled in her neat hand. Ypres, May 1915. Louse, September 1915. Somme, July 1916. Soldiers, hearing of her collection, sent her pressed blossoms from their own sectors, until the herbarium became essentially a floral map of the Western Front, each petal a tiny, silent witness. And then there were the ghost stories. Oh, the ghost stories. The trench was, by any estimate, one of the greatest factories of supernatural folklore in modern history. The Angel of Mons, that towering figure, supposedly seen by British troops during the retreat from Mons in August 1914, hovering between them and the advancing Germans, began as a piece of speculative fiction by Arthur Machen and grew, within months, into an article of widespread soldier belief, with men who had been nowhere near Mons, nevertheless claiming to have seen the angel themselves. The crucified Canadian, a grim legend of a Canadian soldier allegedly found nailed to a barn door by retreating Germans, circulated in countless versions, despite being, on careful investigation, impossible to verify in any single case. The phantom cavalry of Le Cateau, a ghostly troop of horsemen, variously French or Belgian, set to ride along the lines on certain misty nights, was reported in at least a dozen separate letters home. On the German side, the Feldgrau Geisterabende, field grey ghost evenings, became a recognized informal tradition. On quiet nights in reserve dugouts, soldiers gathered in a rough circle by candlelight and told supernatural tales. Some were recycled from Grimm, some were from folk memory, some were, terribly, from that very war. The white figure seen walking the parapet before a raid, the voice calling a man's name from no man's land, the dream of a dead comrade who wanted only to say goodbye. Put it all together, and you get one of the stranger pictures of trench life. A continent full of young men, most of them barely past boyhood, sitting in candlelit holes in the ground, holding hands over homemade Ouija boards, asking their dead friends to speak, studying each other's palms for clues to the next bombardment, crossing themselves at the striking of a match, hoarding buckles inscribed God with us, alongside charms of St. George, pressing poppies into letters home, smuggling Kodaks in their pockets, whispering ghost stories to each other at 2 in the morning, while somewhere in the dark, an owl or something else called across the broken fields. Let me leave you with one image. A wooden board, rough-edged, laid across the laps of 4 young men crowded onto ammunition crates, their fingertips very gently on a small heart-shaped pointer, a candle on a shelf throwing long, slow shadows. One of them, the quietest, a lance corporal from Sussex, has just, in a voice barely above a whisper, asked the board if his brother is there. The other 3 hold their breath. The pointer under their combined fingers hesitates, and then, very slowly, it begins to move, letter by letter. And in the silence that follows, no one, for a long moment, is quite willing to say aloud what has just been spelled. Leave them there. Leave the candle burning. Leave the board to its silence. Because the trench, for all its mud and its noise and its industrial horror, was also, always, this, a place where the living reached quietly toward the dead, and the dead sometimes, in the hopeful imagination of the grieving, seemed to reach quietly back. And if, by this point in our long journey together, you are already drifting, if the candle in that dugout and the candle in your own imagination have somehow merged into the same small soft light, then that is exactly as it should be. You do not need to finish. You never needed to finish. The story will still be here tomorrow. But before you go fully under, let me say one last quiet thing about all of this. About the brass casings and the tame rats and the pressed poppies and the men in parachute silk dresses and the lettuces growing on the sandbag tops. Because when you stand back and look at all of it together, a pattern emerges, and the pattern is almost unbearably human. A soldier tapping a nail into a shell casing in a Flanders dugout in 1916 was performing, in essence, the same ancient gesture as the painter at Lascaux, 17,000 years earlier, pressing ochre onto a cave wall. A man teaching a rat to sit up for a crumb of bully beef was reaching for the same small comfort as a child with a kitten. The drag performer in silk, the knitter of socks, the gardener of radishes, the reader of palms, the writer of bad limericks, all of them were engaged in something quietly, stubbornly profound. A refusal to let the war have everything, a quiet insistence on remaining, against all the evidence, a person. And they were, most of them, just doing their best. With what they had, with who they were, with the hours in front of them. They were not philosophers, they were not saints. They were clerks and farmers and miners and students and shop boys, shoved into a horror none of them had asked for, and they reached instinctively for the only tools their species has ever really had. Making, tending, playing, loving, laughing, telling stories in the dark. Judge them gently, if at all. Most of them deserved far more gentleness than they ever received. Many of them brought their hobbies home. Trench art filled British and French parlours throughout the 1920s. The dumbbells toured Canada for nearly a decade after the armistice. The spiritualism boom of the post-war years grew, in no small part, out of those candlelit dugout séances. The allotment gardens of interwar Europe owe a quiet debt to the sergeant who, one damp morning in 1916, planted radishes in a sandbag. And those who did not come home left behind carved casings and pressed flowers and limericks in trench papers. And those small artifacts have outlived them by more than a century now, resting in glass cases at the Imperial War Museum, at the Historial en Perron, the Australian War Memorial at In Flanders Fields in Ypres. Small things. Small, stubborn, beautiful things. Tonight, as you lie in your warm bed, with your soft pillow and your quiet ceiling, and the hum of a world that is, for you, not at war, spare one slow thought for the 4 men in that dugout on the evening of November 4th, 1915. The knitter, the rat tamer, the limerick writer, the carver of initials. Picture them now, finally asleep on their crates. A half-finished shell casing at one man's feet, a tame rat curled on another's chest, the gramophone silent, the candle burning at last, down to nothing. Breathe in, slowly, and out, more slowly still. Sleep well.